extraordinary exploits of his father to introduce Professor Wygoda first. He is a professor in zoology at McNeese State University in Lake Charles, Louisiana. He, since 1998, has headed the Department of Biology and Health Sciences at McNeese State. In terms of training, and I guess one might say professional background, he's written extensively on frogs and amphibians and technical work in this respect, but we won't be talking about that tonight. He is going to be, as I say, talking about his father and his father's remarkable career, a career in resistance to the Holocaust, a field that is more studied and more appreciated. I think we still too often have the impression of the Jews during the Second World War rather meekly accepting what was handed to them, this extraordinarily dismal fate. Whereas the more we study, the more we see the varied ways in which the Jews did resist. Sometimes by violent means, sometimes by non-violent means, sometimes by simply going on as Jews, trying to live on as Jews. Literally keeping the faith. The story that you're going to hear tonight, the story of Hermann Wygoda, Mark's father, a very different one, about one who actively resisted the Holocaust and survived to write a memoir of his experiences. And this, by the way, is that memoir, which I might add is going to be available for you to purchase if you so choose at the end of this talk tonight. And this story, the story told in it, is going to be the story that Professor Wygoda will give to you now. With that, I welcome Mark Wygoda.
Well, thank you, Dr. Copperman. Everybody hear me well? Good. I want to thank the committee for inviting me to come here to talk to you tonight. It's especially significant. This is the 25th anniversary of these events, and I'm very proud and happy to be here to talk to you. Now, I'm going to begin by first introducing my father to you in a way that you probably don't expect. We're going to take a journey, brief journey, through both time and space. I'm going to start in Italy in 1944 by describing to you an incident that took place involving Hermann Wygoda. And then I'm going to jump 15 years into the future, across the Atlantic to Chattanooga, Tennessee, to acquaint you with the Hermann Wygoda that was my father. Then we're going to go back to Europe, not to Italy, but to a much earlier time, to Germany. So we're going to begin in 1944. I want you to imagine the following scene. Okay, the time is late November 1944. The place, a tiny bridge up in the mountains of northern Italy. In the center of the bridge, there stands a German commander. Next to the commander, the local parish priest. They are awaiting the arrival of Comandante Enrico, shown here in the center, flanked by two of his command staff. Enrico is the leader of a local partisan brigade who's been active in the area, ambushing enemy convoys and troops passing through the mountains. Enrico has previously stationed some of his best marksmen on the bluffs overlooking that bridge, their rifles now squarely pointed at the chest of the German commander. Now, on the other side of the bridge, at the foot of the bridge, there's a German jeep with a mounted machine gun surrounded by several heavily armed German soldiers. Well, Enrico arrives early, as he had planned, and he strode confidently to the center of that bridge. The two officers saluted each other, and they began discussing terms of an upcoming prisoner exchange. Now, that parish priest, Padre Giovanni was his name, he stood in silence as the two men spoke rapidly in German. Now, surely, thoughts were going through that German commander's mind, such as, who is this German traitor anyway? And why is he fighting against his own people? Why are these Italian bandits following him? Well, the two men agreed upon the terms of the prisoner exchange. Enrico was going to release their captain, and the German commander was going to release 3 of Enrico's men who he held captive, plus the 10 civilians who they had taken from the valley as hostages. And then, suddenly, the German commander asked Enrico to leave his troops and come join him to fight for the glory of the Third Reich. Well, Enrico smiled and replied, why don't you leave your troops and come join the partisans? The two men shook hands and they departed. But that meeting, which had been arranged at the request of the Germans, it was only a ruse. They never intended to exchange prisoners. They only wanted to see what Enrico looked like, so that later, after he was captured or killed, they would be able to identify him. Their plan all along was to attack, and indeed, that very night, they launched a major attack against Enrico's headquarters high up in the mountains. Now I'm going to jump 15 years into the future to Chattanooga, Tennessee. I'm going to show you a series of 3 photographs, all taken in 1959. This first photograph, my father, Hermann Wygoda, is shown here proudly displaying the fish he caught that day in Lake Chickamauga. Probably when he was out on his boat, but maybe from the dock that was coming from the cabin that he built on the lake. He put a sign up in front of that cabin naming it Sivlomar, after his 3 children, Sylvia, Lois, and Mark. Now this picture, you see he's smiling broadly. We have very few pictures of him smiling to that extent. And that's because he was constantly plagued by memories of his past. Fishing was his relief from the past. The long hours of quiet solitude waiting for the fish to bite, that gave him peace and contentment. This picture, by the way, was taken on the side of our family home at 3621 Glendon Drive in Chattanooga. The next 2 pictures I'm going to show you, also from 1959, were taken at that home also. This picture was taken on the front porch by my sister Lois, of the rest of us. And yes, that's me in the little gray suit. My father built this house along with hundreds of other family homes in Chattanooga. He came to the U.S. in 1946 unable to speak a word of English. And by 1951, he established the Wygoda Building Corporation. He developed entire subdivisions. He designed all the homes. He contracted for and supervised their construction, and he sold them all himself. All of this during a 20-year period before he retired. He was what you would call the proverbial self-made man. Now this last picture from 1959 was taken on my 8th birthday. And you can see how happy I was. But look at my father's expression. His thoughts were clearly somewhere else. He certainly was not happy looking. He was quite somber. And I know now that on my 8th birthday, he was thinking not only of me, but another son he once had who was murdered when he was 8 years old. I remember quite clearly the first time I ever learned of the existence of Samuel. I don't know exactly how old I was, 4 or 5 years old. I was in my parents' bedroom one day with my mother, and suddenly I spotted this photograph in a frame on the nightstand by my father's side of the bed, and I said to my mother, "Who is that little boy?" And her reply, and the tone she delivered it, sent shockwaves through me. She said, "That was your father's first son. He was killed in the war. Don't ask him any questions." Believe me, I didn't ask any questions. Now, sometime later, I remember hearing from someone, probably my sister Sylvia, that our father's entire family had been killed during the Holocaust. And that further inhibited me from asking any questions. And as a child, I was too scared to ask any questions. And then later, as an adult, I decided to spare my father the agony of remembrance by asking questions. The only time I remember asking him anything about his former life was when I was in elementary school, in Missionary Ridge, the name of the school. And the other boys out on the playground were talking about what their fathers had done during the war. So I came home and said, "Daddy, what did you do during the war?" He told me he was a guerrilla fighter in Italy, and he explained to me what that meant. And I'm sure that everything else I learned that afternoon was in response to specific questions I had asked him. He didn't volunteer anything. I learned that he had been a commander. I learned that his rank was lieutenant colonel. I also found out that he had been awarded medals, and I remember him showing me his Bronze Star medal. Also found out that he had been wounded. He had been shot in the leg. He showed me the scar in his leg where the bullet had entered. But it was only years later that I found out he intentionally misled me about when and where he got that gunshot wound. He had not been wounded in Italy when he was fighting with the partisans. No, it had been a few years earlier, back in Poland, during a failed attempt to rescue Samuel. He misled me because he didn't want to expose me to the horrible truth. And also, he didn't want to have to relive it himself. So, how do I know enough about his life before coming to the United States to be able to be your speaker here tonight? Well, fortunately for me and for you, he was able to put down in writing what he could not bear to talk about. His memoir has to be one of the very first memoirs ever written about the Holocaust. In January of 1945, when the snow was very deep up in the mountains and there was not much fighting going on, he had time to reflect on his life, and he decided he had to write down what had been happening to him. So he began his memoir beginning with the first day of the war, 1st of September 1939. And he wrote it by hand in Polish while he was living in a cave. 21 years later, he himself translated that memoir into English. He died in 1982. His memoir, then an unpublished manuscript, which I later decided to edit for publication. And this is the result in The Shadow of the Swastika by Hermann Wygoda, published by the University of Illinois Press. It's his story as he wrote it. My contribution as editor was to polish the grammar in such a way to maintain his voice throughout. I thought it was important that I do that rather than some anonymous copy editor who never knew him. One other edition of this book exists, and it's the one shown here, the Italian language edition. ISREC Savona, a historical research institute in the province of Savona, Italy, which studies the resistance, translated his memoir into Italian and published it. That same institute staged a major exhibition on his life in 2007. Now let's go back in time. And we're going to go back to Europe with this next photograph. Hermann Wygoda was born on November 18, 1906 in Offenbach, Germany. This photograph was probably taken around 1908. It shows him with his mother and one of his many aunts. After his father died in World War I, his mother, Hannah, who is the lady shown holding his hand, took Hermann and his younger brother Leon back to her hometown of Kossow, Poland, where he was raised. Later, he attended Warsaw Polytechnic Institute and became an engineer. He went back to Germany to work for a large company in Berlin, Siemens & Holzky, which was the forerunner of the present-day Siemens Corporation. But he left Germany, went back to Poland in 1929 because of all the anti-Semitism that he was witnessing. There in Poland, he married. Samuel was born in 1934. He later separated from his wife, and with the help of his mother, his brother, and his brother's wife, he raised Samuel. And my father spent a lot of time commuting by rail between Kossow and Warsaw, where he worked and where he maintained a small apartment. This is a photograph of his brother Leon with their mother Hannah, probably taken in the 1930s. Hannah was a matchmaker in Kossow. Leon was a cabinet maker, but later, after the Kossow Ghetto was established, Leon became a Jewish policeman. Despite my father's best efforts to save Samuel, Hannah, Leon, Leon's wife, and their two daughters were all murdered in Treblinka. We know very little detail about their deaths because that was one aspect of my father's life that he could not bring himself to write about. And what little we do know, I added as a footnote in his memoir. And I'm going to leave their deaths as a footnote to my talk tonight. When World War II started, on September 1st, 1939, my father was in his apartment in Warsaw. He was then 33 years old. When the Germans occupied the city, he refused to submit to their demands. Instead, he went underground, assuming the identity of a Catholic Pole, but not just an ordinary Catholic Pole. No, my father posed as a Volksdeutscher, someone who had German ancestry, Aryan ancestry. He wrote in his memoir that he considered his greatest asset the ability to speak German with no trace of an accent at all. Time and time again, that not only saved his own life, but also the lives of others, including those in the Warsaw Ghetto to whom he smuggled food, and still others who he spirited away to places of relative safety. Now, in his memoir, he provides very little detail about how he actually got into and got out of the ghetto, only that he used secret passageways that were, as he put it, reserved for professional smugglers only. But he did write about what he saw inside the ghetto, especially during the winter of 1941 to 42, when food was very scarce and the utilities had been cut off. He saw the dead and the dying lying out on the sidewalks, while Hitler Youth, escorted by their SS leaders, toured the ghetto and took photographs. He used the terms frustrating, exasperating, heartbreaking when describing his feelings walking along the ghetto streets. He did what he could to bring food to the starving, especially the children, who he said looked like miniature skeletons. Every time he left, he wondered whether he would have the courage and the strength to go back in there again because of all this tragedy he was witnessing. But he did. He kept going back. He said the ghetto continued to draw him in like a magnet. And I know from reading poems he wrote late in his life that it was because of those children that he kept going back. But what he witnessed one day in there in July of 1942 was enough to convince him that it was far too dangerous to go in there again. He had been away from Warsaw for a while, and when he got back, a friend of his, shown here by the name of Stanislaw Gorczyca, warned him that if he was going to enter the ghetto, he needed to be extremely cautious. Stanislaw told him that strange things were happening in the vicinity of the Danziger railroad station, the station closest to the ghetto. Stan told him that the Germans appeared to be assembling all available freight cars there. And strangely enough, they were covering the air vents on those cars with barbed wire and heavy boards. Nevertheless, my father went back in. This time, he said the situation was very different. There was a lot more tension in the air, and whenever a patrol was spotted, everyone, including my father, ran for cover. The people there told him that lately those patrols had been shooting into the crowd indiscriminately. He saw in the distance what looked like a large group of Jewish men and women being led by German police, and everybody fled. He barely made it through a doorway to an apartment building when the door was slammed shut behind him. Every once in a while, he managed to work his way through the crowd of people in there to the door, to look through one of the peepholes in the door. And what he saw out in the street was a column of Jewish men and women. He estimates 18 to 20 people wide, being marched in the direction of the railroad station by German guards with bayonets fixed to their rifles. He said it took about 40 minutes for that whole procession to pass by. He went back out into the street, began to hesitate, but continued on to the place he usually took the potatoes and other food items, only to be caught up in another crowd of people running like crazy. This time, he witnessed the murder of a young Jewish man out on the sidewalk by a Nazi SS officer. That convinced him to leave and not come back. Soon, he found himself working at a German border patrol camp in the town of Terespol, along with another Jewish man, the man shown here on the left. His name was Leon Peregal. Together, the two men made a very good team. Leon, with his skills as an artist and a photographer, he was able to doctor stolen ID cards beyond detection. The ID card shown up here, that's one that Leon carried in 1943. And the little photo up there, that's Leon. In his memoir, my father referred to Leon as a master of disguise. And when I look at that little photo, I see what he was talking about. Who would suspect that that evil-looking man was a Jew hiding in plain sight? Well, my father's contribution was his language skill, combined with his bold nature. Who would suspect that a man who struck up conversations with Germans would be a Jew hiding in plain sight? To give you an example of my father's talents, I'm going to read a passage from his memoir to you. I'm going to let my father's own words describe this to you. This is an incident that took place in March of 1943 after another man at that border patrol camp, a man named Buzinski, became suspicious of both of them. One Friday, we noticed a local Gestapo man walk into the main office building. After a while, he came out with Buzinski. reason enough to leave that place as soon as possible. On Saturday, we requested permission to attend the early morning mass the next day, and permission was granted, provided we reported back to work at 8 o'clock that morning. Sunday morning, we got up very early, and in a roundabout way left Terespol and Buzinski behind us as we went out into the unknown once again. We walked through fields and woods to the next railroad station on the way to Warsaw. 2 hours of fast walking carried us to a little rail stop, and before 8 o'clock in the morning, we were on a train to Warsaw. One had to be lucky those days to go anywhere and arrive at one's destination without incident. It was the beginning of 1943, and the Nazis had a valid reason to be nervous. The more intelligent Germans already knew that the war was lost. The labor shortage in Germany was acute, and the normal recruitment of men was insufficient. The Nazis thus resorted, with ever-increasing effort, to hunting at random for people to be shipped to the German industrial plants. What better way was there than to surround an incoming train, remove all the passengers, load them into trucks, haul them to a camp, and then send them to Germany? People were in constant danger of being caught this way and turned into slaves. For us, the danger was twofold, since we could also be detected as Jews. This would have meant the end of our lives through cruel and agonizing torture. About midway between Terespol and Lukow, our train stopped to let an incoming train through on the single track. As the other train slowed down, people yelled to us through the windows that the station at Lukow was surrounded and that the Germans had taken some people away. Again, the Nazis were on their usual hunting expedition. There was one more stop between us and Lukow, giving me time to think about what to do next. I came up with 3 possibilities. I could jump off the train and possibly get killed, or worse, only injured and fall into the Nazis' hands incapacitated. I could sit calmly in the car until we arrived at Lukow, let the Nazis get me, and try to get away later. Or I could use my main asset, the German language, and try to get away with it. This was an important decision for me, and I decided on the 3rd course of action. I'd never been too generous with time. The time element was always an important factor with me. I had no special reason to be in a hurry, but by and large, I was always moving fast, always thinking of the Germans saying, "Tomorrow, tomorrow, but not today," do all the lazy people say. I lived under the constant impression that if I slowed down, I would lose the thread of events and never catch up again. That was my reason to risk the 3rd alternative. A risk it certainly was, with an immediate climax should I fail to succeed. At the next and last stop before Lukow, I walked out of the car and called Leon to follow me. In the center of the train were 2 cars reserved for Germans, and without hesitation, I entered one of those cars. There were 2 civilians and 2 military men in the compartment. I greeted those present with a religious "Heil" as we made ourselves comfortable. Since Leon's German was not quite as good as mine, I did the talking. Leon remained silent, pretending he had a toothache. I always carried a bottle of vodka with me, and that day was no exception. Although I was by no means a heavy drinker, it was helpful sometimes as a tranquilizer when the excitement was excessive. I took out the bottle and offered the military men a drink after having one myself. They readily accepted. The 2 civilians indicated that they too would like a drink, so I let them have one also. The bottle went around twice, and I left it on the bench since there was little left over. The train pulled into the station at Lukow while we were carrying on a loud and lively conversation. For the first time, I had the opportunity to witness a Nazi razzia taking place at a train station. There were green uniformed police waiting on both sides of the train, allowing no place to escape. As soon as the train stopped, a large loudspeaker issued orders, first in German and then in Polish. In Polish, they told the passengers, regardless of their respective destinations, to leave the train immediately, take all their luggage with them, leave the doors wide open, and proceed to the main waiting room in the station proper. They warned that all who did not follow orders would be shot to death on the spot. The message in German had been different, however. The passengers were told not to leave their cars, to keep their doors locked, and not let anyone in. The whole operation took not much longer than half an hour. The police worked with methodical precision, and after they had completed their job, another group of largely older people boarded the train in a great hurry. During that time, a police officer came by our car and apologized for the inconvenience. He wished us a pleasant trip, said his religious Heil, and moved on. Immediately thereafter, the train moved out of the station. I emptied the balance of my vodka and threw the empty bottle out the window. The Germans in our compartment, apparently made drowsy by the steady motion of the train and the vodka, went to sleep. Leon and I just sat there looking at each other and tried to give the impression that we were not interested in what was going on around us. The two men then went to the last place you would expect Jews to go to seek refuge in Nazi Germany, and that would be Berlin. In the preface to my father's memoir, noted Holocaust historian Michael Berenbaum stated, "Safety is often found in the eye of the storm." In Berlin, they worked for a labor recruiting company owned by two German businessmen, both of whom were members of the Nazi Party. My father had various jobs with the company. At times, he was a translator. At times, a courier. And at times, a foreman. While Leon, who he claimed to be his cousin, worked as a draftsman. My father's job as a courier took him to faraway places, including once a trip to a company mining camp located in far northern Finland. On that particular trip, he took with him a teenage Jewish boy who he had discovered among a group of newly recruited company workers. And with false papers filled out properly by Leon, that boy, whose name we don't know, soon found himself working in a place of relative safety. In his role as translator, my father was assigned to a mining camp under construction in the country of Estonia near the town of Jovi. When he and Leon first got there, they thought about escaping to the Russian front, but they gave up on that idea after 3 men did try, were captured by local hunters, returned to the mining camp, and then hanged in front of the company office. After about 6 weeks there, my father asked for and received permission to take a leave of absence for a few days. He decided to go to Warsaw. He said he wanted to see his friends, but also see if he could help anyone get out of what he called that terrible place. His arrival in Warsaw coincided with the final week of the Warsaw Ghetto revolt. And the day of his arrival, May 12th, 1943, that was the day the Germans set fire to the ghetto. He stayed with a friend named Frank, whose apartment was right across the street from the ghetto. And for 4 days, my father watched what he termed that desperate but unequal fight through a window in Frank's apartment. With the help of Frank and his other friend Stanislaw, he was able to secure papers for 2 teenage Jewish boys who he took back to Jovi with him. Now, sometime after his return to Jovi, he and Leon were transferred back to the company's main office in Berlin. There, they were constantly aware of the dangerous situation they were in, especially because 1 floor above their company office was a Gestapo unit, and they would pass those Gestapo agents almost daily in the stairwells. They figured they were bound to be discovered sooner or later. But thanks to an Allied bombing run over Berlin, they found they could write their ticket out of Germany. You see, what happened was, following that bombing run, the company they worked for was given the contract to clear out the rubble from a bombed-out government building, and my father was put in charge of the job. He was given 100 men, but he went in first to snoop around, and he found what he was hoping to find: blank ID cards, blank travel documents, and most importantly, official government stamps. With these documents filled out the right way by Leon, the two men could go anywhere they wanted in Nazi-occupied Europe. In December 1943, they boarded a passenger train in Berlin and arrived at the Mediterranean port city of Savona, Italy, without incident. This is a contemporary photograph of the city of Savona, Italy. There, they worked for a construction company, and they felt relatively safe. But my father wanted what he termed complete freedom. And even though Leon tried to talk him out of it, he planned his escape to the island of Corsica, which was then occupied by the Americans. He bought a motorboat, and he hired 2 ex-Italian Navy men to navigate. He also acquired pistols, rifles, and hand grenades on the black market. He said he was not going to be taken alive. But in the early morning hours of February 12th, he was arrested in his hotel room. This was not his first arrest. He had been arrested twice before in Poland. The first time was by the Polish police in the town of Warsaw, and I alluded to an incident earlier involving them. The second time was by the Jewish police in the town of Sokolov in the Ghetto. They had arrested him to fulfill a labor quota mandated by the Germans. Now, getting out of these earlier arrests is relatively easy compared to this time. This time he was arrested by the secret field police, which was the military equivalent of the Gestapo. 5 men, a captain, a sergeant, 3 enlisted men made the actual arrest, while other soldiers stood guard in the street outside. They took him downstairs, put him in a staff car, drove him to the military garrison in Savona, questioned him for hours, and then locked him in a cell. He escaped that night. And it was only days later that he found out why they had used such elaborate precaution in arresting him, why they had treated him with courtesy, why they just didn't take him out in the street and shoot him. It turns out they thought they had captured a famous British spy that was supposed to be in the area. Did they ever get that wrong? But he also found out that Leon, too, had been arrested. Now, my father spent the next several weeks living in a cave high up in the mountains northwest of Savona, a cave shown by this arrow superimposed upon this contemporary photograph. And it was there in that cave where he was approached by a group of armed men who asked him to come with them. He knew who they were. He went with them. They took him to meet a high-ranking commander in the Italian Liberation Army who persuaded him not just to join the partisans, but to assume command of one of their units, which was then active in the area. He agreed, and thereafter became known only as Comandante Enrico. His first act as commander was to reorganize the approximately 100 young volunteer freedom fighters in his outfit, and then instilled discipline in them. They were ineffective until my father took over, but he turned them into effective fighters. Initially, they were equipped only with single-shot rifles, but soon they found themselves fighting with captured German automatic weapons, and later with British and American weapons airdropped to them by the Allies. In this photograph, my father is seen holding a British-made submachine gun. They planted mines, they blew up bridges, but mainly they aggressively attacked enemy convoys and troops moving through the mountains. Their fame in the region grew, and so did their numbers as more and more local Italians joined. Enrico split up his platoon of fighters into several platoons, and then later grouped the platoons into 4 separate brigades, each with its own commander. He himself assumed command of the 4th Brigade with a fighting force of some 600 men and a few women partisans. Now, as a partisan commander, my father had the power of life and death. His usual procedure for dealing with captured Germans was to personally interrogate them and then order their executions. Not, he said, for revenge, but instead to carry out what he said was an act of justice against the killers of innocent children. He wrote in his memoir, "In all candor, I have to admit that even if I had possessed the facilities necessary to maintain a prisoner of war camp, the Nazis definitely would have been excluded from such camps. In my opinion, the Nazis were not entitled to any benefit derived from international law or any other custom practiced by civilized people anywhere in the world. But sometimes captured Germans proved useful as pawns in prisoner exchange negotiations. And one such negotiation took place directly with a German commander. That was the meeting in the middle of the little bridge that I told you about in the beginning of my talk. That commander must have been absolutely furious that there was what he assumed to be a German traitor up there in the mountains, commanding those bandits, as he called them. He came to this false conclusion after he had received messages from my father that were handwritten in eloquent and grammatically precise German. I'm going to read to you what my father had to say about those messages. I told the Padre that we did indeed have the officer and proposed that he take a message from me to the Nazi command. I addressed that message to whom it may concern at the German headquarters in Savona. Their missing officer, I wrote, was in our hands. He was tired but otherwise well. I explained that we had captured him to trade for our men whom they had in custody, and I assured them that actions such as the taking of innocent civilians from the valley as hostages would not speed the return of their officer. I threatened to execute their officer immediately if any of the hostages or our men were harmed. Also included was a warning that any attempt to rescue the officer by force would not meet with success. I signed that message with my formal title, Enrico, commander of the 4th Brigade of the Garibaldi, province of Savona. We did not have to wait long for an answer. Late that same afternoon, the poor Padre was back with a reply from the German commander in Savona. The correspondence was in German, of course, so only the Padre and I were able to read it. In his first message written to an avowed bandit, the Nazi commander flatly refused to negotiate any exchange with us on the basis of 13 for 1. I worked late that night by the light of a candle, writing in longhand, since my secretary did not know German, and I was a poor typist. The German commander's letter to me also had been written in longhand, but I doubt it was a lack of secretarial help that had prompted such discretion in his dealings with a bandit. In my answer to his letter, I suggested that the exchange ratio that he found so terribly unfair was by no means my idea. It was, rather, a system introduced by his fellow Nazis in the occupied countries of Europe, where often the imposed ratio was much higher. I further informed him that his total contempt for human rights, as demonstrated by his hasty action in the Ghetto community, made it sufficiently clear that fairness and justice were empty words when uttered by a Nazi. Well, that meeting on the bridge, which I told you about in the beginning, took place within days after those messages were exchanged. If you recall, I told you the Germans attacked that night. However, the German commander's plan to free his captain, to destroy the resistance, to kill or capture my father, failed miserably. The Germans were driven out of the mountains after losing 87 men to my father's loss of only 5. Never again did they try to attack Comandante Enrico's headquarters. Soon, the German commander contacted my father again. He wanted to proceed with the prisoner exchange under the previously agreed upon terms, but my father refused. This time, he demanded that they also supply his troops with 100 pairs of socks, 100 boots, and 100 pairs of long underwear for the approaching winter. And to underscore his point, he sent a squad down into the valley to bring back more Germans. And they returned not too long later with a lieutenant and 3 soldiers. In what must have been the most humiliating experience of his life, that German commander complied with my father's demands in full. 2 months later, the High Command ordered my father to join the 4 brigades together into a single, unified fighting force. And that is how my father became a division commander. He was ordered to command that division. A division consisting now of about 2,500 troops. Here is an artifact from that time. It's a military order that was issued from the command of the 1st Gendevalaqua Garibaldi Assault Division. It was an urgent message sent to the sub-commanders. The message informed them that at the enemy checkpoints, now, even though a soldier's hands were raised, he would be able to send a signal to the other troops just by pushing a switch with his foot. It instructed the sub-commanders that before they are to attack the checkpoints, they are to cut the wires connecting the switch with the alarm back where the other troops are located. That order is signed here, where it says the military commander, by my father. That is the word Wygoda. And I could not understand in the beginning why he always signed his military orders with his real name. But then I realized no one would be able to read that. And likewise, no one would be able to forge it either. On April 25th, 1945, Enrico was ordered by the High Command to take his troops down out of the mountains and liberate the city of Savona. Prior to the liberation, he had 200 of his partisan fighters specially trained to be police officers. And upon the liberation, he established himself as chief of police of Savona, with his partisan fighters constituting his police force. Leon was nowhere to be found. He had escaped from prison the year before and walked all the way to Switzerland. This photograph, by the way, was taken on May Day, 1945, 66 years ago yesterday, during a celebration in the town square in Savona, and my father is seen wearing his full partisan uniform. And what he thought was his final act as an Italian partisan is seen in this photograph, where he is transferring power of the city of Savona from the partisan army over to the regular Italian army when they finally arrived a few weeks later. Now, with that accomplished, he became a police inspector for the city of Savona. And he tried to settle into as a normal life as you can expect for a German, Polish, Jewish, Italian partisan veteran. Well, before the month of May was over, he started receiving recognition and awards. This is a document issued from the Liberation Army. It chronicles the various commands that he held during the war. And I'd like to translate the last paragraph for you. It's interesting. It says, during this time, he participated in all actions against the Nazi fascists, resisted the enemy, and bravely withstood the rigid winter season, always behaving as a good partisan. It's signed at the bottom by his commander, a Colonel Zanari. The following month, in June, he received this certificate to the Patriot. As you can see, it is also signed by Colonel Zanari, but in addition, it's signed by H.R. Alexander, Harold Alexander, the British commander who was the supreme Allied commander of all forces in the Mediterranean. I will read a little bit of this, not the whole thing. The translation reads in part, as commander of the Bevilacqua Division of the Italian partisan movement, Hermann Wygoda, despite the lack of arms and equipment, continually harassed the enemy by constant acts of sabotage and attacks on enemy convoys and troops. In the reborn Italy, the bearers of this certificate will be acclaimed as patriots who have fought for honor and freedom. This ID card was issued in conjunction with that certificate. You can see, oops, wrong button. Over here, it refers to the H.R. Alexander certificate. And here you see my father's signature, Wygoda. This was the first ID card that was not fraudulent that he had carried in the last 5.5 years. Almost exactly 1 year after the receipt of that certificate, this telegram arrived at the police station in Savona. It asked the person named below, as you can see my father's name, to report that afternoon to Milan at a certain address to receive instructions concerning the receipt of an American Decoration for Valor. The last sentence advises him to wear his partisan uniform. In Milan, on June 26, 1946, Hermann Wygoda was awarded the Bronze Star Medal for valor in combat by United States General Mark Clark. General Clark had been in command of all American forces in Italy during the war. He was then stationed in Vienna. He came back to Italy for this occasion. 10 partisans from the approximately 200,000 partisans that fought during the war were selected to receive the Bronze Star Medal that day, and my father was one of the lucky ones. I'm going to read just a line or two from the citation that came with the Bronze Star. Demonstrating amazing ingenuity and skill, combined with unswerving loyalty and heroism in effecting the plans of the Allied commanders, he utilized the facilities at his disposal to the maximum advantage of the Allied forces. And now, as a man named Paul Harvey used to say, and now you know the rest of the story. And you can tell your family and your friends how a German-Polish Jew became one of the greatest heroes of the Italian resistance. I'd like to thank Dr. Copperman and the rest of the committee for inviting me to come here tonight to speak to you about my dad, and I'll be glad to entertain any questions at this time that you may have. I thank you.